Cool. Thank you very much for coming.
Okay, well, thank you very much. All right, so I'll be talking about DAO Democracy. And the talk is up on my website at merkle.com/talks. So if you see a link or something, you don't have to frantically scribble to put it down. And a DAO is a Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and it comes from the world of Bitcoin and blockchains and stuff like that. So what I'd like to do is start out by talking about a compression function. So how many people have heard of a compression function? Anyone heard of it? Wow, lots of people have heard of a compression function. Very impressive. So compression function takes an input, which is big, and turns it into an output, which is small. And the input might be 512 bits, and the output might be 256 bits. And it's a cryptographic primitive. And the interesting property that it has is that it's easy to compute. And what's interesting about it is although it's easy to compute, given the output and given an input, it's hard to find another input that produces the same output. And this compression function is a very useful cryptographic primitive because once you've got it, you can string them together and you can build a tree out of them. And this is a very pretty tree. It's a balanced tree and it's symmetric, same on the left and the right. They don't have to be symmetric. They can be very lopsided. If it's really lopsided, it's more like a linked list, but it could be just a little bit lopsided or very lopsided. So there are lots of things that you can call a tree that you wouldn't normally think of as being a tree. And a tree covers a lot of territory. And in this case, you just take the inputs at the top and you compress them down and they become smaller. And you take two inputs, compress them down, and they become smaller, and then they fit into the inputs of the next compression function, and you can compress them down and they become smaller. And then it falls out the bottom, and then at the bottom you have the root of the tree. And an interesting concept. And oh my, what's this? This is a picture out of my PhD thesis from 1979, which was a while ago, and it shows an authentication tree and an authentication path. It shows you can take a bunch of leaves and you can compress them down into a root, and in fact you can do something interesting here, which is you can actually authenticate one leaf given the root, and you can authenticate it with only log n information. You don't need the whole tree. So you can pick any random leaf and you can authenticate it given the root quite easily. So these authentication trees are useful things, and once you've got the root, you can authenticate any leaf in the tree, and the tree can be pretty big. You can have a tree with billions of entries in it, and you can authenticate any entry easily and quickly, and it's wonderful and marvelous and delightful, and everyone understands that these are wonderful things. So that's all very useful, and it's been understood for a while. I realized back in 1979 that you could authenticate a lot of information, and if you only knew the root, then it was easy to authenticate. The trick with the authentication tree, or at least the trick as far as I was concerned, was once you had an authentication tree and you had a root, you could authenticate anything in the tree but it was hard to update. I didn't know how to update it. So if you had a bunch of updates, you wanted to have an updated root that included the updates. And I didn't quite know how to do that. And then along came Bitcoin, blockchains. And I was very impressed because there was this marvelous sort of way of updating the root. At least that was my perspective on blockchain, is that by Zing, they figured out how to update the root of the tree. And the way you do it is alarmingly simple. You announce that there are a set of rules for the updates. The updates have to follow the rules. And if you follow the rules, then the update is accepted. And if you don't follow the rules, the update is not accepted. And one of the rules is that there have to be a bunch of zeros in this output of the hash function. 40 zeros, for example. Well, that sounds fairly harmless. You have to have 40 zeros in the output of the hash function. The trick is that this hash function is cryptographically secure, so when you compute all of that, the input to the hash function, basically it's random whether you get 40 zeros or not. And if it's 40 zeros, you're going to have to try 1 trillion times before you get your 40 zeros. And you also have to follow all of the other rules. And if you follow all the rules, then you get a piece of cheese. Oh, I'm sorry, you get a Bitcoin or whatever the cryptocurrency. I like to think of it as a piece of cheese, but details. So if you follow the rules, you get your piece of cheese. And if you don't follow the rules, you're thrown out. And everyone knows that you have to follow the rules to get your piece of cheese. So if you follow the rules, then your update is accepted and people will build on your update because you followed the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, no one will accept your update because you didn't follow the rules. And you don't get your cheese because you didn't follow the rules. So you're going to follow the rules. Because if you don't follow the rules, no one will follow your route and you won't get your piece of cheese because you didn't follow the rules. So you have to follow the rules. Otherwise, no one will build on your route. And the rules are alarmingly simple because they also say that the longest chain of routes wins. So if someone else tries to build on the route and they say, aha, I've built on the route, follow me, well, no one will follow them unless they're the longest chain of routes. And no one's going to follow them if they don't follow the rules. So they have to follow the rules. But the longest one is the easiest one to build on. So everyone's going to build on the longest one, and the longest one wins. So everyone's going to follow the longest one because that's the easiest one to build on. And the longest one wins, and everyone knows that in order to win, you have to follow the one that follows the rules. So everyone follows the rules because you have to follow the rules, otherwise you don't get your piece of cheese. And after I hurt my head a bit thinking about this, I realized it was all obvious and decided it was wonderful, simple, and delightful, and that it solved all problems. And the fascinating thing about it is the rules can be almost anything. So, you know, in the case of Bitcoin, there were some rules about how you deal with Bitcoin. But the rules can be anything. It doesn't really matter what the rules are. And the rules let you update the root of the tree, and then you can update the rules, and then you have a new root, and you're on your merry way with a new route which follows the rules, because you have to follow the rules, because if you don't follow the rules, you don't get your cheese. So that's how it works. And now everyone loves it, and billions of dollars are at stake, and somehow that initial prototype is now still working. And I'm really impressed. A piece of code that, by all rights, should have fallen apart by now, is worth, how many billions of dollars is Bitcoin worth at this point? Anyone know the number offhand? Keeps changing. It's a lot. But this is a couple of guys coded up something and it's worth billions of dollars and it hasn't fallen apart. They did a good job. For a prototype, it's amazingly well done and held up pretty well. And of course, everyone wants in on it, so they're all building all kinds of stuff. So that's cool. And it also demonstrates this wonderful idea that you can have a set of rule-based updates, and it demonstrates what's been called a decentralized autonomous organization. I mean, this really makes me wish I'd had something to do with all of this stuff, other than, well, okay, I had to do with the Merkle trees, but I mean, that was just a part of all of this wonderful stuff. All of this sort of loopy, wonderful, you get your cheese and et cetera, that came after me. So a decentralized autonomous organization, I mean, it has these wonderful properties. It's immutable. I mean, it's based on hash functions. And unless you break the hash function, well, all right. For those of you who know Bitcoin, it also uses public keys. So if you break the public key, then you're in trouble. So make sure you don't break the okay, no one here is involved in changing the public key involved in Bitcoin. But if you happen to have any influence, then yeah, that should be shifted to a quantum-resistant public key. So that's a bit of gratuitous advice for anyone who happens to be in a position to do that. Because quantum computers are coming along and they'll appear at some point. So the decentralized autonomous organization, it's immutable. I mean, it's based on these hash function things. And because it's based on these hash function things, it's hard to fiddle with the bits without being noticed. Because everything is hashed, and if the root is secure, then it all hangs off of the root. And if you know the root, then you can check all the bits, and everything's cool. And you have to follow the rules, because if you don't follow the rules, you don't get your cheese. And so everyone follows the rules, so all the bits are all reliable and everything. So you can have something that's immutable and it's transparent. Everyone knows what the rules are, because everyone has to know what the rules are, because everyone checks the rules to make sure the rules are being followed. That's how it works, is everyone checks to make sure that the rules are being followed. That's how the system works. So it's really transparent, like everyone knows the rules. I mean, you can have secrets involved in the system design. Bitcoin has secrets. The secret key of the people involved in Bitcoin is a secret. It's part of the system design. But it's a well-known secret. Everybody knows that a person who owns Bitcoin has a secret key. So it's known that that person there has a secret key. So it's not an unknown thing that they have a secret key. And the rules themselves are known to everyone, because you gotta have publicly known rules. So it's transparent. It's really transparent, and it's distributed. I mean, it's all over the world. Anyone can play. That's how Bitcoin works, and that's how this whole rule-based thing works. It's nonstop. I mean, Bitcoin has been going for years. It started in what, 2009? And it's just been going and going and going. It puts the Energizer Bunny to shame. I mean, if World War III came along and half the planet was blown up, Bitcoin would keep going. If every computer on the planet was fried except for, a handful, and there were a couple of internet connections between them, Bitcoin would keep going. I mean, it's really hard to stop. It just keeps going. And like I mentioned, it's rule-based. So these are pretty good properties. They're nice properties. You can build stuff on top of this. You can build a system And they're properties that are very useful. And there are certain contexts where these properties are critical. If you want to have immutability and transparency and be distributed and be nonstop, and you're willing to put up with the rule-based nature of it, or you want the rule-based nature of it, then this is pretty good. This is something that really gives you, something you want, which is why everyone's all excited about blockchains. And, all right, they're getting overly excited. There are a lot of people who are trying to do things with blockchains that don't make any sense at all. But that's okay. When people get enthusiastic, they get over enthusiastic. So they're, but there'll be a shakeout, and then, after the shakeout, there are things that make sense, right? There are things where these core properties that you've got in this system are useful properties to have. There are things where these kind of properties will turn out to be useful properties. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking about democracies and how governments run. I was thinking, you could probably do something that would help democracies. These properties look like they would be helpful in running parts of, or maybe even all of, a government somehow, some way. So, well, democracy. People are really enthusiastic about democracy. I mean, just the level of enthusiasm for how wonderful democracy is just palpable. This is a fairly typical enthusiastic statement about how wonderful democracy is. It's the worst form of government, except for all the rest. It has been variously attributed, and apparently nobody actually said this, but it's been attributed to everybody. So it must be deeply rooted in our psyche. Yeah, exactly. So, so we're thinking it's something interesting. So, I think one of the things that I'd like to say is, let's imagine that something better is possible. So before we start getting too overwhelmed with how wonderful democracy is, let's think that, maybe we can cook up something. I mean, we have seen progress in governance over the millennia. I mean, it used to be Og the caveman would say, everyone better do it the way I want or I'll hit them with my club. And then, gradually things have improved from that. I think things have improved from there. I'm hoping things have improved from there. So, we now have forms of governance that I think are an improvement over that. And so I think we can cook up better forms of governance and possibly even get them implemented one way or another. So, I mean, anyone who's looked around the world has noticed that perhaps our existing institutions are not always doing as well as we might hope. And furthermore, technological change is accelerating. How many people have heard of the singularity? Just out of, everyone's heard of the singularity. How many people think it might actually happen in the not too distant future? Something vaguely close. Okay, so much more skeptical. The singularity actually is coming along, and something pretty close to it is going to happen, all that. And then there's the question, what is the singularity? Well, I don't know. How many people have heard of Moore's Law? Okay, all right. So you all know that computers are going to get way powerful. Well, Moore's law is going to keep rumbling along, and predictions of its demise are, I think, premature. So, well, it depends. The narrow Moore's law that integrated circuits are going to keep getting more powerful, that might run into trouble. But hey, Moore's law, if you look at it broadly speaking, we've gone from relays to vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits. If there's something after integrated circuits, I'm going to call that Moore's law, the extended Moore's law. So the extended Moore's law is going to keep rumbling along. There might be a few hiccups here and there as we switch to new technologies. But hey, you know, the extended Moore's law is going to keep rumbling along, which means if you extrapolate, we're going to have really powerful computers. And that means we're going to have computers that are way more powerful than humans. And at some point, they become way more intelligent than humans. And that's a close enough approximation to the singularity for me. Because at some point, hey, we have computers that are very intelligent, like more intelligent than us. And then you get all of the nasty jokes about whether or not that's difficult and so forth and so on. But, you know. So, but I mean, the point is technological change is accelerating. It'd be kind of nice if we had governance processes that were able to cope with these things. And the societal cost of poor decisions is increasing. And I think you can all imagine reasons why it might be nice if our governments actually made decisions that were, you know, reasonable. So, and I think looking at it and thinking about it, my conclusion was that the sort of the core issue is voting. And voting is a disaster, just flat out a disaster. I mean, first off, there's very little economic incentive to vote. And there are huge numbers of studies that say, you know, voting is, from the economic perspective, a complete waste of time. People vote for irrational reasons. Now, right off, if your whole system is based on an activity which all the economists line up in a row and say that activity is fundamentally irrational, you start to pause and say, huh, that's interesting. And there's even less economic incentive to determine how to vote. So in other words, voting involves getting up and going to the voting booth and, you know, voting. And determining how to vote involves thinking. This is one of the more painful activities. Most people swore off it at an early age. Generally, it's something done only as an act of desperation. And personally, I try to avoid it as much as possible. But it is something that you need to do if you're going to determine how to vote. You have to read, put in time, effort, energy, filter through all of that news that's coming out about all the various candidates. And of course, there are sophisticated disinformation campaigns trying to convince you to vote this way or that way or the other way. And the people running those campaigns are way more, if not more intelligent. They at least have way more time than you do to figure out how to take advantage of your of your biases and prejudices to get you to vote in the way they want you to vote by presenting information in ways that is skewed and in ways that you hardly even recognize as skewed, and also to penetrate sources that you rely on. Do you believe, you know, your local pastor or your local newscaster or whoever it is you trust? They will go to great lengths to, how do I phrase it, compromise them. or persuade them, is I suppose the nicer way of putting it, persuade them to align with their particular views, and they are not very picky about the methods they use. So sophisticated disinformation campaigns. Candidates also behave unpredictably once elected. So you think about the candidate and what they're promising and what they look like they're going to do. They get elected and they go in the exact opposite direction. So that's rather disconcerting. And then, of course, as we all know, half of voters are below average, which causes some issues of itself. So my apologies, I've had a cold the last week, so, and a bit of a sore throat. So I'm going to be coughing periodically through the talk. Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with someone who argued with me about that. So median, average, is the average the median? Can I use the term average to mean median, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So pick your particular term and we'll go forward. You get the idea. The concept, I think, is clear. Majority rules, and we're, in an interesting situation. So, ta-da! As Nietzsche would put it, adventavit asinus, pulcheret fortissimus. Enter the ass, beautiful and most brave. The solution is DAO Democracy, and the rough idea is that we are going to replace Congress. Everyone always perks up when I say that. With a self-improving DAO that passes bills that maximize the future collective welfare as determined by a prediction market. So this sounds good. Of course, everyone says, what's a self-improving DAO? What's a future collective welfare? And what's a prediction market? So I threw in a few future forward references here. So we'll have to explain what they are. So what is a DAO? A DAO is one of those immutable, transparent, distributed, non-stop, rule-based thingies. So what's not to like? And a self-improving DAO can use the built-in prediction market mechanism to improve its own code base. And the prediction market uses human intelligence enabling a DAO to make intelligent decisions. There's no reason the market mechanism couldn't use machine intelligence transitioning the DAO to an AI. So now I've only got one forward reference, which is what's a prediction market? So a prediction market, well, looking it up in Wikipedia, we find that a prediction market is an exchange-traded market created for the purpose of trading the outcome of events. The market prices can indicate what the crowd thinks the probability of the event is. A prediction market contract trades between 0 and 100%. Okay. Well, let's give an example. Suppose I want to know whether or not we're going to land on Mars in 2030. So I go to the bank and I say, bank, please issue me 2 instruments. One instrument pays off $1 if we land on Mars in 2030, and one instrument pays off $1 if we do not land on Mars in 2030. And I have 2 instruments. So I take these 2 instruments and I say, I, being a clever prognosticator, know that we are going to land on Mars in 2030. So this instrument that pays off $1 in 2030 is worth something. And because I know we're going to land on Mars in 2030, that means this instrument that says we're not going to land on Mars in 2030 is a worthless scrap of paper. So I will sell this valuable instrument to you for 50 cents. And I've just now made 50 cents. And I go, ha, 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 ha. I've made money. Ha, 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 ha. And the public has now discovered that the probability that we will land on Mars in 2030 is 50-50 because the market price of the instrument is 50 cents. So the public has gained knowledge. I've made out like a bandit because I secretly know that we're going to land on Mars in 2030, assuming I'm correct in my secret knowledge. And that's a prediction market. So that allows me to use my secret knowledge to make money by exposing my secret knowledge in a market-based mechanism whereby I trade based on my knowledge and using my resources to move the market in a way that allows me to make money and the market to shift in ways that reflects my knowledge of the situation. So it's a method of aggregating knowledge across multiple people and allows that knowledge to be made public and allows those who know what's going on to make money in exchange for making that knowledge public. So that's good. And then we have the collective welfare. So prediction markets are based on the concept you're predicting something, right? Do we or do we not land on Mars in 2030? Well, if you're going to be using a prediction market for governance, then you're going to have to predict something about the future of governance. If you're going to have a democracy, you're going to have to use this prediction market to predict something about the future of the democracy. So what do we predict? Well, it's democracy, right? Well, we predict how well the democracy democratized. How well are we keeping all the citizens happy or satisfied or whatever? So thoughts like these lead to the concept of, well, what you do is you go around to all the citizens and you say, rank the democracy, the government, your well-being, whatever it is you want to call it, between 0 and 1. And every citizen provides a number between 0 and 1. And you add up all the numbers and divide by the number of citizens. This gives you a number between 0 and 1. And now you do this once a year. So every year you compute this number, whatever you want to call it. Well, we can call it the collective welfare. You compute this number every year. And then you can, after 10 years, you can add up and divide by 10, and you've got the collective welfare for the decade. So you can now start talking about what is the collective welfare for the decade. So now you've got something to predict. So you can now say, well, we have a prediction market. Let's use the prediction market to predict the collective welfare. And you can now ask questions of your prediction market like, hey, if I pass this bill, would this improve the collective welfare or not? And the prediction market, oh, oracular prediction market, we come to you and ask you whether this bill will improve the collective welfare. So now we've made various assumptions, and now based on these assumptions, we can get a response, and the response is, yes, this bill will improve the collective welfare. Very well then, this bill is now blessed by the prediction market. We pass the bill, we adopt it, and we roll forward. So now we have a concept that says, gee, we can pass a bill if our prediction market says that it will improve the collective welfare. So there are a bunch of concepts floating around in there, but the basic one is we need to have some way of telling what is better, what is good. And essentially, we just go around and ask people, how do you feel about the state of democracy, the state of the world, the state of your health, the state of your happiness, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, interpreting this number between 0 and 1 is an interesting philosophical question. But if you're going to say you've got a democracy, then you want to treat everyone equally. Well, if you go around and get a number from everybody, then you're treating everyone equally. And if you add those numbers up and divide by the number of people in the democracy, then that seems to be treating everyone equally. So arguably, this is democracy. So that seems to be satisfying one of the basic requirements. And then you're using your prediction market to try and enhance or improve or increase this number, which hopefully reflects the collective welfare. And then you can get into arguments about, you know, is this the right way to do it? Are there other ways of doing it? And so forth and so on. But that's the basic concept. And now what we've essentially done is we've replaced Congress with a self-improving. So let me repeat what I said before. We replaced Congress with a self-improving DAO. Okay, so we've now got a self-improving DAO. What does a self-improving DAO mean? That means we use the prediction market mechanism to update the components of the DAO itself. Just as we can pass a bill that says we are going to do something in the world, we can pass a bill that says we're going to update the internal workings of the DAO. And if that looks like a good idea, if the conclusion is that the prediction market says yes, 10 years from now, people will look back and say this looks like it was a good idea, or 20 years, or whatever you want to use as your time frame, then sure, why not? Let's go ahead and do it. So you can have a self-improving DAO, and you're going to maximize the future collective welfare as determined by a prediction market. Yes? Okay, so the question is, what about the tyranny of the majority where a bunch of folks get better off, but some folks get destroyed? And the question is, hey, what about that? What about a situation where some people get better off, other people get worse off, and you wind up with a problem where you're basically having a sharp distinction where the haves get better and the have-nots get worse, and you're trading it off. That looks like it's sort of a fundamental problem, and I think it's less, how do I put it? You don't get the kind of problem you get today. Today you have a problem where a very small percentage of the population gets, 90% of the wealth. And if you look at this is saying, are you feeling better about the way things are going? It's unlikely that you'll get a small percentage of the population jumping up a vast amount, and jumping up a vast amount enough to justify squelching a large percentage of the population. In other words, you're not getting a small percentage of the population getting vast wealth. You're getting a small percentage of the population getting a little increase in sort of their value because you're looking at individuals and you're not weighting them excessively. So you don't have wealthy people who have, you're not saying everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. You're saying, hey, just add up the numbers. And as a consequence, the question you're asking is valid, but it's much less likely to occur than in a situation where you're talking about wealth, where you can have someone who gets a vast amount of wealth by acquiring it on the backs of a large number of poor people. Yes? Mm-hmm. Ah, right. Right. So again, if you look at what's going on, if you have a situation where the majority thinks the small minority should, be inconvenient, should be, have their rights taken away, and the majority likes that, the DAO democracy pays no attention to what people want. One of the nice things about the DAO democracy is it's looking at what are these people going to say about how their life is going 10 years from now. So the DAO democracy is not looking at what people say they want. It's looking at what do they say about their life on this 0-1 valuation 10 years down the road, which is a different valuation than coming to a person and saying, hey, do you think that we should let those people use the bathroom? And people get emotional and say all kinds of interesting stuff. But if you come to them 10 years later and say, after you let people use the bathroom, and you ask them, how's your life going? They'll probably say, hey, I'm fine, because they won't have noticed or they'll have forgotten about all of that stuff that occurred. And unless it really affected them, they won't care. And the prediction market, if it's doing its job, will correctly say, I'll bet those people who are very emotional about that issue will have forgotten about it 10 years from now. So that's why the prediction market has value. It's looking at what people will actually think about, what their day-to-day lives are like 10 years from now, rather than their emotional response about what they think would be a good idea today. So one of the key things going on here is that this whole concept is intended to separate out people's core emotional reaction, which occurs, what actually influences me, what is bad for me. I mean, if you make a decision that harms the economy and people are out on the streets, hungry, that's going to have an immediate negative response. I mean, the prediction market is going to say if you pass a bill that's going to result in bad economic problems and people losing their jobs, the prediction market will say, that's a bad decision, and it will say it real fast. If you have a decision that isn't going to affect people in any way that matters to them, the DAO democracy will say, people aren't going to care about that. So that's probably how it would play out. And of course, I don't know because I'm speculating about how the decisions would happen. But that is how I would expect such decisions to play out. Ooh, lots of questions. So I'll tell you what, why don't I sweep from the left? Go for it.
Stability of the social welfare metric and offset for that matter only can happen in a fair way. Although you can do that over full enumeration, when talking about the metrics are how did you maximize all of the questions?
I am stomping. Yeah, okay, so the question is, hey, I'm taking all these people and I'm having them give a number between 0 and 1, and I'm adding them up, and I'm stomping over all kinds of very interesting philosophical assumptions, and I'm breaking all kinds of rules, and anyone who looks at this closely will realize that this is fraught with all kinds of problems, and the answer is, I'm just ignoring them. Right? I'm just walking in, fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and I'm saying, hey, this looks like it is plausible, and I'll bet this is better than what we've got now, is essentially what I'm saying. And then I will defend the thesis that it looks better than what we've got now in the face of myriad theoretical objections as to the soundness of the, deep underlying structures. And then with all of the discussion of the deep underlying structures, I'd be happy to entertain a proposal that had a better grounding with respect to sort of the philosophical issues if such a proposal emerges from the discussion. But in the meantime, we've got a proposal which is, oh, this looks simple and easy to understand, and I'll bet it's better than what we've got. So why don't we talk about it? That's about as far as I've got. So, yes.
So maybe you just answered the question. Yeah. So general assumption is that the prediction market is better than
No, better than Congress. Better than Congress. I'm setting the bar low here, so I can claim that this is a vast improvement over the existing system rather than some hypothetical alternative. It's a standard debater's sort of trick. But yes, by all means, proceed.
fair enough. No, the point I was trying to given that the economic since the then how do we expect the prediction market to be better than
How good are prediction markets? Yeah. I think the question was how good are prediction markets? Is that the gist of it?
in the I guess you could.
Okay. So the answer is there are people who spend their lives studying prediction markets, and their opinion seems to be, prediction markets aren't bad. They aren't magic, but they seem to be as good as any of the other mechanisms that people have proposed, and they're better than a lot of methods that people have tried out. So given that they seem to be, as good as anything else, what the heck, why not? And they're fairly easy to understand, and they produce pretty good results. And given the current sort of structure, I would have a hard time arguing that the current system is producing pretty good results. So the argument that I would advance is not that prediction markets are perfect, but again, I would simply argue that prediction markets used in this particular structure would likely produce better results than the existing system. And they seem to be pretty good when compared with sort of alternative proposals. And then if you want a deeper answer, then you have to go to the whole literature on prediction markets and start pinning down people who spend their lives doing research on prediction markets and say, hey, what about the prediction markets? Where do they stand as opposed to other proposals? And, you know, generally they seem to be pretty good. Yes?
I just wondered what's going to happen here. Put up a bill that says flatten out the tax structure. What's going to happen? Or rather, to somebody who's going to be
Right.
manipulated.
Yeah, and the answer is that people have looked at manipulation of prediction markets, and the general response is that to the extent that people try to manipulate prediction markets, essentially that opens up the prediction market to profiteers who come in and say, oh goody, someone's putting in a subsidy for me to make money. Because the moment you try to manipulate the prediction market, essentially you're driving the prediction market away from accurately predicting what it's supposed to predict, which means that someone who is purely driven by greed will come in and say, huh, someone is driving the market off from being accurate, and they will treat that basically as a subsidy for them to come in and clean up by putting the market back on something that is more or less accurate. So essentially the prediction markets, you know, yes, they are subject to being swayed by, you know, money that comes in and moves them in various directions, but no more so than any other mechanism or any other sort of mechanism for saying what's going to be happening. And to the extent that someone comes in and says, aha, I'm going to manipulate the market, the moment that's identified, everyone swarms in and says, yum, money on the hoof. I can make a buck by countering whoever is trying to manipulate the market. Yes? Good question. Yeah, so the question is, this sounds like a good way of evaluating sort of simple proposals. How do you set the tax levels, et cetera? How do you come up with complicated proposals like, for example, the Affordable Care Act? And the answer is that if you come up with the Affordable Care Act as one lump and just walk up and say, boom, here it is, then you can give it an up-down vote and evaluate it. But the process of deriving it, because that process is very complicated, is completely outside the scope. So the answer is, I don't think, and I don't quite know how to come up with a complex bill sort of within the structure. So one would have to have someone outside the scope of a DAO democracy cook up the bills, and then they feed it into the system and say, here is a bill, what about it? Or alternatively, you can have people come up with other structures. You can say, let us have a structure for coming up with a bill for an Affordable Care Act. So let's have a proposal for a committee that will derive the Affordable Care Act or whatever. Yeah, well, I don't know if Congress is an ideal structure. So there are interesting questions like that. But yeah, you raise a good question, and I think one of the responses that I would make on a global level is that, okay, these sound like a bunch of nice ideas. Why not go try them at some level in some sandbox or in some pilot thing and see what happens? Because lots of people have lots of good ideas, that, you know, sometimes they turn out well and sometimes they turn out badly. Why not give it a shot somewhere and see, you know, is this going to actually do well, or is this one of those things that sounds good, but gee golly willikers, it's not quite going to do it. Yeah, I was going from the left. What? Here? Yeah. There. What? Who was it? Yeah. Okay, so when you are asked, you know, how do you feel about this year's welfare, you give a number between 0 and 1, nothing conditional about it. So this year you give an answer. Next year you give an answer for next year. The year after you give an answer for that year. So each year you give an answer for how you feel about things that year. And then the prediction market can then start trying to predict how you would feel in the future. So the prediction market, you can play all kinds of games about, you know, conditional markets and if this, then that, et cetera. But that's in the market, not in the fundamental welfare, collective welfare that you gather. You have a data stream gathered directly from the citizens that says, here's how I feel this year, here's how I feel next year, here's how I feel the year after. That provides your core data stream. And then you have all of this market apparatus built on top of that. Yep. Okay. Yes?
Can you say something about the floating point of price for IBM?
I was asked to say something about floating point precision and the stock price of IBM. I know nothing about the stock price of IBM. I assume it fluctuates. And floating point precision is something that I know exists. There is a finite mantissa, and you can have more bits of mantissa depending on the type of floating point number you have. Next.
How would you imagine the life cycle of a democracy? The democracy doesn't really pace for conclusion. The basic rules of writing a DAO are similar to writing. Maybe I need to sharpen my game theory pencil, but you starting in a point and reaching a local optimum doesn't necessarily mean the universal optimum. Science that. How do you imagine a life cycle where a DAO is replaced by another more advanced system?
So the question is, once you set one of these things up, won't it tend towards a local optimum? And then once it's in a local optimum, isn't it trapped in the local optimum? And is there any way out of the local optimum? And how would you do that? And the answer is, that's a good question. I like that question. I don't know. I mean, the only argument I would have is that because it's a DAO that allows anyone to come forward with a strategy that could be voted on, someone could walk in and say, here's a way of changing everything to get to that other optimum over there. And if the other optimum over there was a better place that would improve the collective welfare, it would be evaluated and the DAO would say, huh, you're right. If we're over there, it's better, and you've got a process for getting us there that doesn't cause us wreckage. Let's follow that strategy. So that's about the only thing I could say, is that if someone does present a plan for getting to a better place, then that plan would get adopted. On the other hand, incremental changes would be, well, incremental changes might be difficult, and probably the system would settle in. And unless someone comes along and presents a bold strategy for going to the new optimum, you'll probably just settle in and be happy. Yes? So I'm not quite sure I quite follow. You're saying that the 0-1 sort of voting thing would allow people to buy votes, is that? Hmm? Oh, okay. So, all right. So this gets into the whole question of, hey, should votes be secret? Should votes be public? Can you buy votes? Should you buy votes? Should you outlaw the buying of votes, et cetera? And my assumption is that, gee, people have outlawed the buying of votes, and it's generally viewed as a bad thing, and the secret ballot is viewed as a good thing. So I don't see any strong reason to change those assumptions. So why not keep those, at least as a first approximation, as we move into a DAO democracy? So if you want to, pick a number between 0 and 1, okay, let's keep it secret, and you're not allowed to sell your vote. And if you try to do it, that's considered bad form, and you have various incentives not to do that. I'm not sure I quite follow. You're basically arguing that if we have a DAO democracy, it would be easier to buy votes? Not sure I quite follow that. We could talk about it more. Yeah. Okay. Interesting question.
Oh, I have a related
Mm-hmm.
question. All the dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
All these things we value,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're getting crunched down to a 1 scale. So it
Yep.
might be the case that trends in arbitrary evaluation of the 0,
Mm-hmm.
or some dominant factor that sets the 0-1, or ends up masking important changes that are happening locally or for other reasons. So in other words, one issue might end up tipping the prediction market on many other unrelated issues affected because they got swept up on this upcurrent on the time, or were just less happy. And so it made it look like people who were short in the market made good predictions, but actually the policy was bad. It was just that everyone felt worse due to some other event happening the day before.
Yeah, well, one of the things going on here is that if you look at this as a single structure for dealing with everyone at all places, it's pretty obvious that you're going to have some sort of structure beneath it. In other words, one of the first things you do if you've got a DAO democracy is dealing with the world is you say, well, would it be a good idea to have regional structures that are going to have some sort of way of dealing with regional issues and sub-regional structures? In other words, would it make sense to introduce a hierarchy? And one has to suspect that that would happen and introduce more in the way of prediction markets all the way down. But at the top level, one has to suspect that utilizing some sort of prediction market strategy would be a reasonable way of making decisions, because if you look at the way decisions are made right now at the top levels, you go, interesting. So, yeah. Yep. Let's see, have I swept everyone over at this side? Yes. Well, you just said it. If it doesn't affect welfare, who cares? I mean, I think that a DAO democracy would be sort of relentlessly pragmatic. And what, you're postulating that welfare goes up because we kick out Muslims?
That is a
Oh, noise in the prediction market? Yeah, okay, one of the issues that I'm really not quite sure how to deal with at the moment is what do you do with noise in the prediction market? In other words, there are issues where the prediction market just can't cope with it because, hey, there's noise.
It wasn't the noise that they're asked about. It was the fact that many policies get mapped. Yeah, so that the overall in 10 years better policies that are like today will have gotten swept into them.
Well, you're doing a comparison between two futures, right? I mean, the mechanism by which you check a policy out is you say, here's a future where you don't have the policy, here's a future where you do have the policy. What does the prediction market say about the two futures? And then you have a number and you say which one is going to be bigger. So you basically got a built-in control. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so if I can summarize, what you were saying is that the value that people report, the 0-1 value, is going to be a very local value and is likely to be swamped by events in their life rather than sort of the broad socioeconomic things that you might want to capture. And how can you use this value as a underlying value upon which to base broadly based social decisions? And I think the answer is that's the only thing you really can base broadly based social decisions on. I mean, if we don't base our social decisions, if we don't base our policies on what people are actually feeling, then what are we basing it on? In other words, in aggregate, if a policy has no impact on what people are feeling, what are we doing? What are we talking about? So we have to have policies that have an impact, and if there is an impact collectively and statistically across a group of people, then the policy has an impact and has an import that is important. If statistically it has no import, if statistically a policy is not impacting people at a level where people care, what's the point of the policy? It's, you know, what are we talking about here? I think that's the answer.
to a single data stream, quality of life. The ability to search the alternative space for viable solutions that address the higher dimensional is lost, which is to say information bandwidth of the process is compromised. So the ability to search that space is also compromised. Ask this same question in terms of the information bandwidth of the optimization process before attempting to collapse it into a single variable, which you can potentially argue valid idea, but pragmatically, all of the people here who are pointing out that other devils in the details with respect to the scale factors of the quality measure, look at theory and mechanism design, quality of life measure you had. You really have to look at this than just sort of the conceptual idea that you can fold optimization into.
So, okay, so I think your basic question is, hey, we're asking people to say, how has your life been? Give it a 0-1 value, and then we'll, adjust the government based on that. How can one possibly collapse everything to a 0-1 value? And I think that's, there are various interesting questions there. Obviously, one can go out and do a lot of surveys, one can get more information, but at the end of the day, I think you have to ask the question, where are you in terms of, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Has the government been doing things that are good or bad? And in some sense, the world that you have is going to be measured on a scale which is, how do I put it? I mean, when you face life, you get to make decisions between alternatives. And when you make a decision between alternatives, you pick those alternatives that you prefer over those alternatives you don't. So arguing that there is more complexity, yes, there's more complexity, and we could utilize that in thinking about the process. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to, at some point, say, okay, given this complex range of things, which do I prefer? What do I want to do? Yeah, you got to figure out what you want at some point.
But for that argument to be valid, you have to search the entirety of the space, which is following one little path doesn't get you to an information which searches the whole. But the argument is only valid if you search it.
Well, if you want all of the information, clearly you can search that space by looking at alternative proposals or alternative concepts that you say, here are alternative proposals, here are alternative concepts, and seeing what the response is from the prediction markets to those alternative ideas and alternative concepts.
I buy that.
Okay. Yes.
In trouble. Multiple governments have city governments, federal governments. Philosophical justification has been one area will not be public. The only thing that I started out, okay, have one level of government.
Right.
And you run this on the highest level. But if you do that, coal miners, efficient, a wholly different farmers in New Jersey.
Okay, so the question is, if you ran this on a national level, what happens when you try to evaluate a national level organization? So let's say we take Congress and we say, Congress, thank you very much for your services. We are now going to replace you with a DAO Democracy. And we do that at the national level, and we leave everything else intact. So we continue to have the states and the local governments as they are. And we simply say, Congress, instead of passing bills, the DAO Democracy will pass bills in the place of Congress. And now a bill comes up, it's presented to this new DAO Democracy, and the DAO Democracy looks at what's going on and says, is this bill going to benefit the bulk of the people in the United States over the long term, over the next 10 years? Will people say it's a good idea? And if it benefits people, then it will say, yes, it's a good idea, and if not, it won't. I would predict that any attempt to make this change will meet with fearsome resistance, because obviously any change in the way things work is going to change who benefits and who loses. And the moment you change who benefits and who loses, the losers are going to put up a fearsome fight. And the people who benefit will say, well, I'm not sure this is actually going to happen. And if it does happen, I'm not sure I'm going to benefit. So they're lukewarm defenders. So there's going to be a lot of resistance. So I think it's not going to happen abruptly. It's only going to happen slowly, and it's only going to happen over a period of time. But essentially what would happen is that if it does happen over a long period of time, you would see a decision-making process where the decision-making process would be a pragmatic decision-making process that would benefit everyone in the long run. So decisions would not be based on sort of the current horse trading philosophy. The decisions would be based on what is it that benefits people in, overall in a 10-year time horizon. Yeah, one more question. Who hasn't asked a question? You haven't? Okay, go for it. Oh, yeah. Well, that one, it turns out, okay, so the question is, how do you deal with newborns and those who die? And the mechanics of that are fairly straightforward. You go to the mechanisms you got, and you say, how do you want to handle newborns and those who die? Does it benefit or not? Does the prediction market say that a particular mechanism benefits or does not benefit what's going on? My anticipation would be that you would simply say people who die all put in a permanent value of 0 from there on out, and people who are born would be allowed to enter the system unless the existing people object to it. In other words, what you do is you use your mechanism to say, if we allow people who are born and who are offspring of existing members of the system to enter the system, would that be something that would, on balance and according to the prediction market, benefit the people in the system? If the answer is yes, then they're allowed into the system. If the answer is no, then, hey, you don't let them into the system. Because if the answer is yes, it would benefit the people in the system, it's hard to see an argument that says you shouldn't let them into the system. If the prediction market says letting them into the system would not be of benefit to the people in the system, then it's also hard to see how you can let them into the system if the prediction market is saying you shouldn't let them into the system. So fairly straightforward. You just hand it to the prediction market.